I sat in my car outside Mason and Associates' law office, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The manila envelope on the passenger seat contained everything I'd need today: bank statements, property records, and most importantly, the files from my mother's old computer. Dad had no idea what was coming. 2 months ago, when he'd called me into his study to discuss the inheritance situation, I'd already guessed what was coming. The way Sandra, his new wife, hovered in the doorway with that smug little smile. The way her precious son Tyler lounged against the bookshelf, pretending to examine Mom's old first editions while shooting glances in my direction. "Emma," Dad had said, folding his hands on the desk. Mom's desk, the one she'd used to write her novels. "I've been thinking about the future, about what's fair. Tyler's starting his business venture, and he needs capital. Your mother would have wanted." I didn't let him finish that sentence. Nobody got to tell me what Mom would have wanted, not after everything. "It's fine, Dad," I'd said, standing up. "Give it to Tyler. He needs it more than I do." The look of relief on his face had almost broken me. Almost. But that wasn't the real reason I smiled and walked away that day. Mom had always told me that timing was everything. In her books, in life, in justice. "Sometimes," she'd say, tapping away at her keyboard late at night, "the best revenge is letting people think they've won." I checked my watch. 9:55 a.m. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Sandra and Tyler would be there, of course. They hadn't let Dad make a single financial decision without them since the wedding 2 years ago. 6 months after Mom's death. 6 months that Dad spent in a fog of grief, barely eating, barely sleeping, until Sandra swooped in with her casseroles and her sympathy and her divorced single mom sob story. I pulled down the sun visor and checked my reflection. Professional, composed. Mom's pearl earrings caught the morning light. She'd left them to me in her private will, the one Dad knew nothing about. Just like he knew nothing about her second bank account, or the offshore investments, or the fact that she'd seen right through Sandra from the beginning. "Keep these safe," Mom had whispered during those final days in hospice. "And keep your eyes open, baby. The vultures are already circling." I grabbed the envelope and stepped out of the car, my heels clicking against the parking lot asphalt. The law office occupied the 3rd floor of a gleaming downtown building, all glass and steel and modern angles. So different from the cozy Victorian where Mom had written her bestsellers, the home where I'd grown up, the home Sandra had redecorated within weeks of moving in. The elevator ride gave me time to center myself. I'd practiced this moment countless times in my head, rehearsed every possible reaction. Dad would be hurt, of course, betrayed. But the real betrayal had happened long before today, when he'd let Sandra convince him that Mom's success had been mostly luck, and that her estate should be redistributed more fairly. The elevator doors opened, and I saw them through the glass walls of the conference room. Dad, Sandra, and Tyler already seated. Sandra's perfectly highlighted hair caught the fluorescent light as she leaned over to whisper something in Dad's ear. Tyler was scrolling through his phone, probably checking on his latest business venture, the 3rd failed startup he'd attempted in 2 years. Mr. Mason, Mom's longtime attorney, caught my eye as I approached. He gave me a slight nod. "Emma, sweetheart," Sandra called out as I entered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We were just saying how nice it was of you to be so understanding about everything." I took my seat across from them, setting my envelope on the polished conference table. Dad wouldn't meet my eyes. He was fidgeting with his wedding ring, his new one, not the one Mom had given him 30 years ago. That one had disappeared into Sandra's special keepsake box months ago. "Before we begin," Mr. Mason said, adjusting his glasses, "I need to confirm that everyone present understands the purpose of this meeting. We're here to finalize the transfer of Catherine Lawrence's remaining estate assets to Tyler Matthews, as requested by James Lawrence." Yes. Sandra waved her hand dismissively. "We've been over all this. Tyler has some time-sensitive investment opportunities that require immediate—" "Actually," I interrupted, sliding the envelope forward, "there are a few documents we need to review first." Tyler finally looked up from his phone. Something in my tone must have caught his attention. "What documents?" Sandra's perfectly plucked eyebrows drew together. "Everything was settled weeks ago." Mr. Mason cleared his throat. "Miss Lawrence is correct. There are some pertinent materials that recently came to light." He began pulling papers from my envelope, laying them out methodically. "Mom kept detailed records," I said, watching Dad's face. "Of everything. She was always so organized, remember, Dad? Every receipt, every transaction, every email." I emphasized that last word, and saw Sandra's fingers tighten around her designer handbag. I don't see why we need to waste time on old paperwork, Tyler interjected, trying to sound bored but failing to hide the nervous edge in his voice. These aren't just old papers, Mr. Mason explained. These documents reveal a pattern of systematic financial manipulation dating back to Mrs. Lawrence's illness, including evidence of tampered medication dosages, altered medical records, and unauthorized access to her personal accounts. Dad's face went pale. What are you talking about? Show him the emails first, I said quietly to Mr. Mason. He nodded and slid a printed chain of correspondence across the table. Dad's hands shook as he picked up the papers. The emails were dated 3 months before Mom's death. Exchanges between Sandra and Tyler, planning everything. They'd known about Mom's heart condition, known exactly what medications she was taking. Sandra had used her position as a pharmaceutical sales rep to access restricted information. Tyler had an old college friend working in the hospital's IT department. Once the old lady's out of the picture, Dad read aloud, his voice breaking. James will be easy to handle. He's already half broken. Just keep pushing the grief counseling and those extra anxiety meds I'm getting. He couldn't finish the sentence. Sandra's face had lost its perpetual smile. James, darling, these are obviously fake. Emma's just jealous. She's always been resentful of our happiness. The metadata's been verified, Mr. Mason cut in. As have the bank transfers. Dad flipped through the pages with trembling fingers, color draining from his face with each new revelation. Bank statements showed small but consistent withdrawals from Mom's accounts during her hospital stay. Times when Sandra had volunteered to help with the paperwork. Changes to prescription dosages that didn't match Mom's doctor's orders. Emails discussing how to slowly gain control of the estate. There's more, I said softly. Mom knew, Dad. She figured it out near the end. That's why she set up the separate accounts. Why she made arrangements with Mr. Mason. She knew what Sandra was, but she was too weak to fight by then, so she left the evidence for me to find. Tyler stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. Mom, we should go. Sit down, Mr. Matthews, Mr. Mason said firmly. The police are already on their way. We have enough evidence here for criminal charges. Sandra's perfectly maintained facade finally cracked. You little bitch, she hissed at me. You planned this all along. No, Sandra. You planned this all along, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I just waited for the right moment to expose it. Mom taught me patience, remember? All those hours I spent in her study, watching her plot her mystery novels. She always said the key was letting the villain think they'd won. Dad had his face in his hands now. The weight of his betrayal, not just of me, but of Mom, of their 30 years together, seemed to physically crush him. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but not yet. There was more he needed to hear. The new business venture Tyler's been pushing for, I continued. It's a shell company. They were planning to transfer all the inheritance money offshore. Once it was gone, they would have disappeared, leaving you with nothing, Dad. Just like they've done to 3 other widowers in the past 5 years. Tyler lunged for the door, but the police officers entering the conference room were faster. James Lawrence? One of the officers stepped forward. We'll need to take your statement about the medication tampering. The hospital records show significant discrepancies during your wife's final weeks. Sandra had gone completely still, her designer handbag clutched to her chest like armor. The mask of caring stepmother had vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. She was already assessing angles, planning her defense. I did everything for you, she spat at Dad. You were pathetic after she died, moping around that dusty old house, crying over her stupid books. I gave you a reason to live again. You gave me lies, Dad whispered, finally looking up. His eyes were red but clear, like he was truly seeing her for the first time. You used my grief to blind me, made me doubt everything I knew about Catherine, about Emma, about myself. I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness watching the officers handcuff Sandra. Tyler was already being let out, crying about calling his lawyer. After they were gone, the conference room fell into a heavy silence. Mr. Mason quietly gathered the documents, giving Dad and me a moment. Through the glass walls, I could see the police cars pulling away, their lights flashing against the building's reflective windows. I don't expect you to forgive me, Dad finally said, his voice rough. I failed you. Failed your mother. Everything we built together all those years, I let them poison it. I moved to sit beside him, feeling the anger I'd carried for 2 years starting to soften. Mom knew you were vulnerable. That's why she protected what she could. She wasn't angry at you, Dad. She was angry at them for targeting you. The way I treated you, Emma, giving away your inheritance, was wrong, I finished for him. But you weren't yourself. They made sure of that. The anti-anxiety medication Sandra was sneaking into your food. The way they isolated you from your old friends, from me. Dad reached for my hand then, and I let him take it. His fingers were cold, trembling slightly. It reminded me of when I was little, how he used to hold my hand through every thunderstorm, every doctor's visit, every first day of school anxiety. Your mother, he started, then had to clear his throat. In those last days, did she say anything else about me? I pulled Mom's old journal from the envelope, the last one she'd kept, her handwriting growing shakier toward the end. She wrote you letters, one for each month after she was gone. She knew. She knew how hard it would be. She wanted to give you time to grieve naturally, not be rushed into moving on. Mr. Mason quietly excused himself, closing the door behind him. Dad stared at the journal like it was something precious and dangerous at the same time. I didn't read them, I told him. They're yours. But maybe we could read them together? Dad opened the journal with shaking hands, and Mom's familiar handwriting flowed across the pages. Her words were full of love, understanding, and gentle guidance for the grief she knew would come. She talked about their life together, about me, about the dreams she had for our future as a family. My dearest James, he read aloud, voice cracking. If you're reading this, then Emma has been braver than I could have hoped. Trust her now, as you always trusted me. She has your strength and my intuition, a combination that would make any mystery writer proud. I smiled through my tears, remembering how Mom used to joke that I'd inherited the best of both of them. She never stopped believing in you, Dad. Even when she discovered what Sandra and Tyler were planning, she knew you'd find your way back to yourself. I stopped wearing my real wedding ring, he said suddenly, the guilt heavy in his voice. Sandra said it was time to let go, to move forward. I know where it is, I said quietly. Sandra didn't throw it away like she told you. She kept it, along with Mom's other jewelry. The police found everything in her safety deposit box. They'll return it all once the investigation is complete. Dad buried his face in his hands again. How did I not see it? All the little things that didn't add up. The way they rushed me to change the will, to sell the beach house, to stop talking about your mother. They knew exactly what they were doing, Dad. The police found evidence of their other victims. All widowers, all wealthy, all systematically isolated and manipulated. You're not the first person they've done this to, but you are the first one whose wife outsmarted them. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. That sounds like Catherine, always 3 steps ahead in her plotting. Remember how she used to spread her story notes all over the dining room table? Color-coded index cards? I laughed softly. And she'd get so mad if we moved them. She wanted to tell you herself, I continued, touching the journal gently, about the evidence, about Sandra's real identity. But by the time she had all the pieces together, the medication tampering had already weakened her too much. She knew she had to trust me to finish what she started. All those times you tried to warn me about Sandra, about rushing into the marriage. Dad shook his head. I accused you of being selfish, of not wanting me to be happy. You weren't yourself, I repeated. The combination of grief and whatever Sandra was slipping into your food. Dad, the toxicology reports show she'd been drugging you for months, just enough to keep you confused, dependent. It's all in here. I tapped the stack of evidence. When you agreed so easily to giving away your inheritance, he said slowly, I should have known something was wrong. The Emma one raised would never just walk away without a fight. I learned from the best. Mom always said timing was everything. There's something else you should know, I said, pulling out one final document. Mom didn't leave everything to me to protect it from Sandra. She did it because she had plans for it. Plans we made together during those last weeks. I slid the paper across to him. It was a proposal for the Catherine Lawrence Foundation for Grief Support, a legitimate organization dedicated to helping widows and widowers avoid predatory relationships during their most vulnerable times. She wanted to turn her experience into something meaningful, I explained. A way to help other people who might be targeted like you were. Support groups, financial counseling, background check services, all the things that might have protected you. Dad stared at the proposal, his eyes moving over Mom's familiar letterhead. This is perfect. This is exactly what Catherine would have wanted. We can build it together, I said softly. That's why I didn't fight about the inheritance. I knew we'd need you for this, Dad. Your experience, your story. It could help so many people. The foundation's already been registered, I continued. Mr. Mason helped me set everything up. We have an office space downtown. and I've been in contact with several therapists who specialize in grief counseling. We even have a retired detective who wants to volunteer his services to help screen potential new relationships. Dad looked up at me with a mixture of pride and remorse. You've been planning all this while I was. He trailed off, unable to finish. While you were healing, I finished for him. Yes, Mom and I both knew you'd need time. She wrote about it in her letters, about giving you space to grieve naturally, about not rushing you. That's partly why I waited to reveal everything about Sandra. You needed to see it for yourself. But what about your life? Your career? You've put everything on hold for this. I shook my head. Not on hold, just redirected. Remember how Mom always said every experience, even the painful ones, could be turned into something meaningful? The foundation is already getting calls, I said, pulling out my phone to show him the website. People who've been through similar situations. Children who are worried about their grieving parents. Even a few funeral directors who want to refer their clients. Mom was right. There's a real need for this kind of support. Dad scrolled through the site, pausing at the About Us section, where Mom's photo smiled back at him. It was one of my favorites, taken at her last book signing, her eyes bright with life and purpose. She wrote the mission statement. I told him. It was one of the last things she did. Look, I pointed to the words beneath her photo. Love doesn't end with loss. It transforms into something new, something that can light the way for others walking through darkness. That's your mother, Dad whispered, touching the screen gently. Always finding the light in everything. He looked up at me, really looked at me, for the first time in 2 years. I'm so sorry I lost my way, Emma. I know, Dad, and we have time to fix things. The Foundation's first support group meeting is next week. We could go together if you want, share our story. He nodded slowly, then reached for Mom's journal again. But first, I think I need to read these letters. All of them. And maybe you could stay while I do? There's so much we need to talk about. I'd like that, I said, feeling the wall between us finally starting to crumble. And afterward, maybe we could go back to the house? I saved all of Mom's books when Sandra tried to donate them. They're in storage, waiting to come home. Home, Dad repeated, as if testing the word. Yes, it's time to make it feel like home again. Mr. Mason knocked softly before entering. The police need those final statements, but they said it can wait until tomorrow if you'd prefer. And Emma, the Foundation's first board meeting is scheduled for next week. We'll handle the police tomorrow, I told Mr. Mason. Right now, Dad and I have some catching up to do. I gathered the documents back into the envelope, leaving out only Mom's journal. Catherine would be proud, Mr. Mason said, smiling at both of us. Of both of you. She always said you had her determination, Emma, and your father's heart. After he left, Dad and I sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Through the windows, I could see the city stretching out below us, life moving forward as it always did. Somewhere out there, Sandra and Tyler were facing the consequences of their actions. But here, in this quiet room, something broken was finally beginning to heal. Should we get coffee? Dad asked hesitantly. That little place your mother loved is still around the corner. We could take these letters there, start reading them together. Caribou coffee, I smiled. Mom always said they had the best scones. We gathered our things and walked out together. In the elevator, Dad turned to me suddenly. You know what I keep thinking about? That last Christmas with your mother? Remember how she insisted on making those horrible gingerbread cookies? I laughed, really laughed. For the first time in what felt like years. They were like rocks, and she kept saying the recipe was fine, we just needed to believe in the process. And then she finally admitted she'd been writing her latest mystery while baking and accidentally doubled the flour. Dad chuckled. His eyes were wet, but his smile was genuine. She never could focus on just one thing at a time. The elevator doors opened to the lobby, and we stepped out into the late morning sunshine. The coffee shop was visible just down the block, its green awning fluttering in the breeze. As we walked, Dad carried Mom's journal carefully, like the treasure it was. Emma, he said softly, thank you for not giving up on me. Inside the coffee shop, we found a quiet corner table. The same one where Mom used to sit for hours, plotting her novels and watching people. The barista remembered us, her eyes widening in recognition. She brought over 2 hazelnut lattes and fresh scones without us having to order. Dad opened the journal, and together we began to read Mom's first letter. Her words flowed over us like a gentle stream, washing away the pain and betrayal of the past 2 years. She'd known this moment would come, known we'd find our way back to each other. My loves, Dad read aloud, his voice steady now. If you're reading this together, then everything has worked out exactly as I hoped. Remember, the best stories aren't about the mysteries we solve, but about the bonds that help us solve them. Take care of each other. Love, Catherine. I reached across the table and took Dad's hand. Outside, the city moved on, but in this moment, we were home.